Was the Boxer Rebellion the beginning of the end for Imperial China? The Boxer Rebellion Part 2. This is the second of my videos looking at the revolt that occurred in northern China at the end of the 19th century. In this video, we look in detail at the outbreak of the conflict, the cost in lives, and the aftermath. If you'd like to watch the first video before this one, go to the Boxer Rebellion, also known as the Boxer Uprising, was an anti-foreign, anti-imperialist and anti-Christian uprising in northern China from 1899 until 1901. It occurred towards the end of the Qing dynasty and was conducted by the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. One significant outcome that occurred in the following decade or so after the Boxer Rebellion was the historic and dramatic changes that saw the end of the Qing dynasty and ultimately the end of more than 2,000 years of imperial dynasties within China that began in 221 BC with the creation of the Qing dynasty. Qing armies. The military power of the Qing dynasty had been dealt a severe blow during the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95. This led to military reforms that were still in their early stages when the Boxer Rebellion erupted, and they were expected to pick up their arms and fight once again. However, the bulk of the fighting was conducted by those soldiers already based around Zili, a Chinese province dissolved in 1922, with soldiers from other provinces only arriving after the main fighting had ended. The failure of the Qing to withstand the Allied forces was not surprising, given the limited time they had for reform and the fact that China's best trained soldiers were not committed to this conflict, mostly remaining in barracks in the provinces of Huguang, later renamed as the provinces of Hubei and Hunan and Shandong. The officer corps was particularly inadequate, with many lacking the basic knowledge of strategy and tactics through experience gained in actively commanding soldiers in the field. In addition to this, many of the regular soldiers were inadequately trained, lacking marksmanship qualities, while the cavalry was ill-organized and not used to its full extent. Despite these failings, when led by courageous officers, the soldiers would often fight to the death, a marked improvement on the findings of those involved in the First Sino-Japanese War, intensifying the crisis that led to the Boxer War. In January 1900, Empress Dowager Cixi changed her position on the Boxers and issued edicts in their defense, which led to protests from foreign powers. In response, Cixi urged provincial authorities to support the Boxers, although few did so. In the spring of 1900, the Boxer movement spread rapidly to the north from Shandong into the countryside surrounding Beijing. Boxers burned Christian churches, killed Chinese Christians, while intimidating Chinese officials who attempted to stand in their way. American Minister Edwin H. Conger sent a cable to Washington, D.C., stating that the whole country is swarming with hungry, discontented, hopeless idlers. On the 30th of May, the diplomats, led by the British Minister Claude Maxwell MacDonald, requested that foreign soldiers come to Beijing to defend the legations. The Chinese government reluctantly agreed to this request, and the next day a multinational force of 435 naval personnel from 8 countries left their ships and travelled by train from the Taku forts close to Tianjin to Beijing. On their arrival, they set up defensive perimeters around their respective missions. On the 5th of June 1900, the railway line from Tianjin to Beijing was blocked by Boxers that left Beijing isolated as far as the Western powers were concerned. 5 days later, on the 11th, at Yongdingmen, the secretary of the Japanese legation, Sugiyama Akira, was attacked and killed by the soldiers under the control of General Dong Fuxiang, who were guarding the southern part of Beijing's walled city. Dong's soldiers had threatened the foreign legations in the summer of 1898, shortly after their arrival in Beijing, and this resulted in United States Marines at that time being positioned in the city to guard the legations. On the 11th of June, the same day the railway was put out of use, the first Boxer was seen inside the legation quarter before being captured by German soldiers and then executed. In response to the execution, thousands of Boxers attacked the walled city that same day, set fire to many of the Christian churches, burning alive many of the people sheltering inside. British and American missionaries took refuge in the Methodist mission, and an attack on that mission was beaten back by US Marines, while the soldiers guarding the British Embassy and German legations shot and killed several Boxers during attacks. Then Boxers, along with other Chinese, attacked and killed several Chinese Christians around the legations in revenge attacks for foreign soldiers killing Boxers attacking the legations. Seymour Expedition. As the situation in Beijing grew more violent, the Eight Powers authorities at Dagu dispatched a second multinational force to Beijing on the 10th of June 1900. This second force consisted of 2,000 sailors and Marines under the command of Vice Admiral Edward Hobart Seymour, with the largest contingent of the force being British. The second contingent moved by train from Dagu to Tianjin under an agreement with the Chinese government, but with the railway being destroyed between Tianjin and Beijing, Seymour resolved to continue forward to the break and repair the railway or progress forward on foot if necessary, as it was only 120 kilometers from Tianjin to Beijing. Prince Qing, who favored the Western powers, was replaced at the Imperial court by Manchu Prince Duan, a member of the Imperial Isang-Gyoro clan who was anti-foreigner and pro-Boxer. Duan soon ordered the Imperial army to attack the foreign forces. Confused by the conflicting orders he received from Beijing, General Nie Shicheng allowed Seymour's army to pass his forces on their trains. Upon leaving Tianjin, Seymour's army quickly reached Lanfang, where the railway was destroyed. Seymour deployed engineers to attempt to repair to the damaged tracks, but before this was accomplished, they were surrounded. They came under attack from all directions by a combination of Chinese irregulars and Imperial soldiers. An estimated 5,000 of Dong Fuxiang's Gansu braves and an unknown number of Boxers won a costly but important battle over Seymour's army at the Battle of Lanfang on the 18th of June. Artillery shells were raining down on the surrounding army, but the source of the barrage could not be located, while the Chinese soldiers deployed a combination of pincer movements, ambushes, and sniper attacks on the largely British force. Upon hearing of the attack on the legation quarter in Beijing, Seymour ordered his army to advance along the Beihe River towards Tongzhou, which is just 25 kilometers from Beijing. The following day, the 19th, his army was halted as further resistance was encountered, with more than 200 wounded, low on food and medical supplies. They quite by accident stumbled upon the great Hisku arsenal, a hidden Qing munitions cache, a supply the Eight Powers had no knowledge of until then. Dug in and awaiting rescue, a Chinese servant was able to slip through the lines of Boxer and Imperial armies before reaching Tianjin and informing them of Seymour's location. By this time, Seymour's army was surrounded under almost constant attack and on the point of being overrun when a force of 1,800 Russian soldiers from Port Arthur, 500 British and others arrived on the 25th of June to bring relief to those stranded at the munitions cache. On leaving with what could conceivably be carried, what couldn't be moved was destroyed, and Seymour's army returned to Tientsin unopposed. On arriving back on the 26th of June, casualties totaled 62 killed and 228 wounded. Conflict within the Qing Imperial Court. While Seymour's army had been attempting to reach Beijing in the city at the Imperial court, Empress Dowager Cixi had summoned her inner court for a mass audience on the 16th of June to address the issue of using the Boxers to evict the foreigners from the city or to find a diplomatic solution. In response to a high-ranking official who doubted the efficiency of the Boxers, Cixi replied that both sides of the debate realized the popular support for the Boxers, which was almost universal in the countryside, and that suppression would at that time be difficult as well as unpopular, especially as they had already engaged in skirmishes with the foreign soldiers that were on the march towards Beijing. Siege of the Beijing legations. On the 15th of June, the Qing Imperial forces deployed electric naval mines in the Behe River to prevent ships of the Eight-Nation Alliance from attacking along that waterway. With a difficult military situation in Tianjin and a total communications breakdown between that city and Beijing, the Allied nations took steps to significantly reinforce their military presence. 2 days later, on the 17th, under Russian Admiral Yevgeny Alexeyev, the Allied forces took control of the Dagu forts that gave them control of the approaches to Tianjin, and this enabled the Allied forces to significantly increase their presence onshore. When Empress Dowager Cixi received an ultimatum that same day demanding that China surrender total control over all its military and financial affairs to those foreign forces, she defiantly stated before the Grand Council, now they, the powers, have started the aggression and the extinction of our nation is imminent. If we fold our arms and yield to them, I would have no face to see our ancestors after death. If we must perish, why don't we fight to the death? It was at this point that Cixi began to blockade the legations with the armies of the Peking Field Force, which began the siege. Cixi further stated that I have always been of the opinion that the Allied armies had been permitted to escape too easily in 1860. Only a united effort was then necessary to have given China the victory. Today, at last, the opportunity for revenge has come. Cixi further added that millions of Chinese would join the cause of fighting the foreigners, since the Manchus had provided great benefits on China. On the 19th of June, after receiving news of the attack on the Dagu forts, Empress Dowager Cixi immediately sent an order to all legations that the diplomats and other foreigners depart Beijing under escort of the Chinese army within 24 hours. The following morning, diplomats from the besieged nations met to discuss the Empress's offer. It was quickly agreed by the majority that they didn't trust the Chinese army to offer safe passage out of the city and beyond. Fearing they would be killed if they agreed to the Empress's demand, they refused the request to leave. The German Imperial envoy, Baron Clemens von Kettler, was infuriated with the actions of the Chinese army and was determined to make his complaints known to the royal court. Against the advice of the other foreigners, the Baron left the legation with a single aide and a team of porters to carry his sedan chair. On the way to the palace, von Kettler was killed on the streets of Beijing by a Manchu captain with his aide managing to escape and bring news back to the legation of the Baron's death. News of the Baron's death left the other diplomats fearing they too would be murdered if they left their legation quarter, and the legations were hurriedly fortified as best as possible. Most of the foreign civilians, which included a large number of missionaries and businessmen, took refuge in the British legation, the largest of the diplomatic compounds. Chinese Christians were primarily housed in the adjacent palace of Prince Fu, who had been forced to abandon his property by the foreign soldiers. On the 21st of June, Cixi offered an imperial decree stating that hostilities had begun and ordered the regular Chinese army to join the Boxers in their attacks on the invading soldiers. This was a de facto declaration of war, but the Allies also made no formal declaration of war. Regional governors in the southern provinces who commanded substantially modernized armies, such as Li Hongzhang in Guangzhou, Yuan Shikai in Shandong, Zhang Zedong in Wuhan, and Liu Kenyu in Nanjing formed the Mutual Defense Pact of the southeastern provinces. They refused to recognize the Imperial Court's declaration of war, which they declared an illegitimate order, or a Luanming, and withheld knowledge of it from the public in those regions. Yuan Shikai used his own soldiers to suppress Boxers in Shandong, while Zhang negotiated with foreigners in Shanghai to keep his army out of the conflict. The neutrality of these provincial and regional governors left the majority of China's military forces out of the conflict. The Republican revolutionary Sun Yat-sen even took the opportunity to submit a proposal to Li Hongzhang to declare an independent democratic republic, although his proposal was never anything more than an initial suggestion. The legations of the Eight-Nation Alliance were located to the south of the Forbidden City and were besieged by the Chinese army and Boxer irregulars from June the 20th until the 14th of August 1990. There were a total of 473 foreign civilians, 409 soldiers, marines and sailors from the 8 countries of the alliance, and around 3,000 Chinese Christians taking refuge. They were under the command of the British Minister to China, Claude Maxwell MacDonald, and defended the compound with small arms, 3 machine guns and 1 old muzzle-loaded cannon. This cannon was dubbed the International Gun because the barrel was British, the carriage Italian, the shells used were Russian and mainly crewed by Americans. Chinese Christians in the legations led the foreigners to the cannon, and it proved to be extremely important in their defense. Also under siege was Beijing's Northern Cathedral of the Catholic Church, which was defended by 43 French and Italian soldiers, 33 Catholic priests and nuns from various countries, and around 3,200 Chinese Catholics. Those defending this structure suffered heavy losses from lack of food, as well as from mines, where the Chinese exploded in tunnels dug beneath the compound. The number of Chinese soldiers and Boxers that besieged the legation quarter and the Baitang remains unknown. Attacks on the cathedral were led by Zaiyi's bannermen of the Tiger and Divine Corps. During the 22nd and 23rd of June, a combined unit of Chinese soldiers and Boxers set fire to areas to the north and west of the British legation, hoping the frightening tactic would lure out the defenders. The nearby Hanlin Academy, a complex of courtyards and buildings that house the oldest and richest library in the world, known as the quintessence of Chinese scholarship, caught fire, with each side blaming the other for the destruction of the invaluable books lost in the Inferno. After failing to burn the foreigners out, the Chinese army adopted a different strategy of using barricades to surround the legation quarter and advance slowly on the foreign lines. As they advanced, the defenders were forced to retreat a few feet at a time. This tactic worked well and was especially effective in attacking the Fu Palace, which was defended by Japanese and Italian sailors and soldiers guarding most of the Chinese Christians taking refuge there. Barrages of bullets, artillery and firecrackers rained down on the legations almost every night, but overall did very little damage. Sniper fire, however, did prove to be quite effective among the foreign defenders. Yet despite their overwhelming numerical advantage, the Chinese forces did not attempt a direct assault on the legation quarter, something the defenders were surprised didn't occur, for they felt such an organized assault would have been easy by a strong, swift force, as the numerous Chinese soldiers could have annihilated the entire force of the defenders within an hour. American missionary Francis Dunlap Gainwell, together with his crew of fighting parsons, helped fortify the legation quarter, although they impressed upon the Chinese Christians to complete the bulk of the physical labor of building defenses. The Tartar Wall, defended by Germans and Americans, was perhaps the most crucial of all the defensive positions. Standing 45 meters or 45 feet tall and 12 meters or 40 feet wide, it was vital this position held. With the German barricades facing east and the American ones facing west, the Chinese advanced towards both positions by moving their barricades ever closer. Captain John Twiggs Myers, the US commander, stated that his men all felt they were in a trap and waiting the hour of their execution. On the 30th of June, the Chinese forced the Germans off their section of the wall, leaving the Americans alone in its defense. The scene of 20,000 Boxers storming the walls and described as deafening yells, with the roar of gongs, drums and horns sounding like thunder as they stamped the ground with their feet, waved their swords, dressed in red turbans and uniforms of blue cloth as they advanced to within less than 20 meters of the gate. 3 or 4 volleys of fire from the Marines left more than 50 attackers dead on the ground. A Chinese barricade advanced to within meters of the American positions, and the defenders had to abandon the wall or force the Chinese to retreat. At 2 a.m. on the 3rd of July, a force of 56 British, Russian and American sailors and Marines launched an assault that caught the Chinese off guard, killing around 20 Chinese, while the remainder fled from the barricades. After this attack, the Chinese did not attempt to advance their positions on the Tartar Wall for the remainder of the siege. The 13th of July was the most harassing day of the siege, according to Sir Claude MacDonald. The Japanese and Italians defending the Fu Palace were driven back to their last line of defence, while a mine was detonated beneath the French legation, almost succeeding in forcing the French and Austrians to abandon their positions. 3 days later, a senior British officer was killed, and the journalist George Ernest Morrison was wounded. American Minister Edwin H. Congler established contact with the Chinese government, and on the 17th of July, an armistice was declared by the Chinese. Conflicting orders and infighting among officials and commanders. There were several instances of the Chinese army not working in unison. General Ronglu came to the conclusion that it was futile to fight all the Western powers simultaneously and declined to fully support the siege. In opposition to this, Zai wanted artillery for Dong soldiers so that they could destroy their legations. However, Ronglu blocked the transfer of artillery to Zai and Dong, preventing them from attacking the legations. Ronglu forced the soldiers under Dong Fuxiang's command to pull back from completing the siege and destroying the legations, thereby ultimately saving the foreigners trapped inside and then making diplomatic concessions. Ronglu and Prince Qing sent food to the legations while using their bannermen to attack the Gansu Braves under Dong Fuxiang and the Boxers who had been besieging the foreign legations. Ronglu and the prince issued edicts that ordered the foreigners to be protected, orders which the Gansu Braves ignored, hence the internal fighting. The Boxers were also taking their orders from Dong Fuxiang, as Ronglu deliberately hid an imperial decree from near Shichang that ordered him to stop fighting the Boxers due to the foreign invasion, and that the population was suffering as a result. Due to the action taken by Ronglu, Nir continued fighting the Boxers, killing many of them as the foreign armies were making their way towards Beijing. Ronglu also ordered Nir to protect the foreigners and save the railway from its being destroyed by the Boxers. Because part of the railway was saved as a result of Ronglu's orders, the foreign army was able to be transported easily into the interior towards Beijing. Nir committed thousands of his soldiers to fighting the Boxers instead of using them to fight the Eight-Nation Alliance. Subsequently, Nir took the blame for attacking the Boxers and sacrificed his own life at Tientsin by remaining within range of the Allied guns. Xu Jinchang, who had served as an envoy to many of the states under siege in the legation quarter, argued that the evasion of extraterritorial rights and the killing of foreign diplomats are unprecedented in China and abroad. Xu and 5 other officials urged Empress Dowager Cixi to order the repression of Boxers, the execution of their leaders, and a diplomatic settlement with foreign armies. In response, Cixi was outraged and sentenced Xu and 5 others to death for willfully and absurdly petitioning the imperial court and for building subversive thought. They were executed on the 28th of July 1900, and their severed heads were placed on display at the Saishikou execution grounds in Beijing. While Empress Dowager Cixi may appear to have been one of the main protagonists in escalating the confrontation at the legations, Cixi did not personally order the imperial soldiers to conduct a siege. Cixi had initially ordered them to protect the foreigners in the legations, although even this could be subject to some discrepancy when viewing the death of the German Baron von Kettler. Prince Yuan led the Boxers to loot his enemies within the legation, and although imperial authorities expelled Boxers after they were let into the city and went on a looting rampage against the foreigners, they also attacked imperial soldiers during that period of wanton destruction. Older Boxers were sent outside Beijing to halt the approach of foreign armies, while the younger Boxers were absorbed into the Gansu Braves. With such conflicting allegiances and priorities motivating various armies inside Beijing, the situation within the city became very confusing. The foreign legations found themselves surrounded by both Qing Imperial and Gansu armies, with the Gansu army of Dong Fuxiang by then swelled by the addition of Boxers wanting to press further with the siege. Ronglu's soldiers seem to have largely attempted to follow Cixi's decree and protect the legations. However, to protect the satisfaction of some voices within the imperial court, Ronglu's men fired on the legations in addition to setting off firecrackers to give the impression that they too were attacking those trapped inside. Inside the legations, with no communication from the outside world, the defenders of the legations simply fired on any targets that presented themselves, including firing on messengers from the imperial court, civilians, as well as anyone threatening to bring them harm. Dong Fuxiang was denied artillery held by Ronglu, which stopped Dong from levelling the legations as he aspired to do. When Dong complained to Empress Dowager Cixi on the 23rd of June, she dismissed his complaint, saying, "Your tail is becoming too heavy to wag." Gassili expedition. The navies of the 8 alliance nations began building up their presence along the coastline of northern China from late April 1900. Several international armies were sent to the capital with varying levels of success, which eventually saw the Chinese defeated by the alliance. British Lieutenant General Alfred Gassili was appointed as the commanding officer of the alliance, which eventually numbered 55,000. The majority of the forces were the Japanese, with 20,840 men under the control of Fukushima Yasumasa and Yamaguchi Motomi. The French were led by General Henry Nicholas Frey and consisted mostly of inexperienced Vietnamese and Cambodian conscripts from French Indochina. The 1st Chinese Regiment, which was later praised for its performance, was made up of Chinese collaborators that served with the British military. Notable events of this unit included the seizure of the Dagu forts that helped command the approaches to Tianjin, and the boarding and capture of 4 Chinese destroyers by British commander Roger Keyes. Among the foreigners besieged in Tianjin was a young American mining engineer named Herbert Hoover, who would later go on to become the 31st President of the USA. The international force captured Tianjin on the 14th of July, suffering the heaviest casualties during the Boxer Rebellion at the Battle of Tientsin. Having a base at Tianjin, the international force marched onwards towards Beijing, a distance of 120 kilometers or 75 miles, with an army of just 20,000 soldiers and sailors. On the opposing side were approximately 70,000 Qing Imperial soldiers and an estimated number of somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 Boxers between them and Beijing. However, the Allies only encountered minor resistance with battles at Beizang and Yangsun. At the battle in Yangtze, the 14th Infantry Regiment of American and British soldiers was led by Russian General Nikolai Linovich. The weather was a major obstacle, with extremely humid conditions, with temperatures reaching a high of 42 C. The extreme temperatures and attacks by insects plagued the Allied soldiers not used to such conditions. Soldiers became dehydrated, with some horses dying in the heat, while Chinese villagers killed soldiers that strayed from the main force while searching for water sources. The tactics along the route to Beijing were gruesome by both sides. Allied soldiers beheaded Chinese corpses in addition to bayoneting those that were still alive at that point. Some took to raping Chinese girls and women. Russian Cossack soldiers reportedly killed Chinese civilians without question, and a Chinese civilian was kicked to death by a group of Japanese soldiers. In response, the Chinese committed similar acts of violence and cruelty, particularly among any Russians they captured. Lieutenant Smedley Butler saw the remains of 2 Japanese soldiers that had been nailed to a wall. Their tongues had been cut out and their eyes gouged. Butler was wounded during the assault on Beijing in the leg and chest, and later received the Brevet Medal as recognition for his action in the fighting. The international force finally reached Beijing on the 14th of August. Following the Beiyang Army's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese government had heavily invested in modernizing its army, and they were equipped with modern Mauser repeater rifles and Krupp artillery. 3 modernized divisions of Manchu bannermen protected the metropolitan area of Beijing. 2 of those divisions were under the command of anti-Boxer Prince Qing and Ronglu, while a 3rd division fell under command of anti-foreign Prince Duan and his 10,000-strong Hushen-Ying or Tiger Spirit Division, which had joined the Gansu Braves and Boxers in attacking the foreigners. It was a Hushen-Ying captain who had assassinated the German diplomat von Kettler. The Gansu Braves under Dong Fuxiang were described by some historians as being ill-disciplined, were armed with modern weapons, but were not trained to a high standard. They did, however, lead the defeat of the alliance at Lanfang during the Seymour expedition, and were renowned as being the most ferocious when besieging legations in Beijing. The British won the race to be the first international forces to reach the besieged legation quarter. The US was able to play a role due to the presence of their ships stationed in Manila since the conquest of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and the subsequent Philippine-American War. The US military referred to the Boxer Rebellion as a China relief expedition, and US Marines scaling the walls of Beijing is an iconic image in the US of the Boxer Rebellion. The British reached the legation quarter on the afternoon of 14th of August, bringing relief to those trapped inside for 55 days. The Baitang was relieved on the 16th, first by the Japanese, although the French claim the overall victory as being theirs. Qing court flees to Xi'an. With the foreign armies arriving into Beijing, the Qing court fled to Xi'an, among them Empress Dowager Cixi travelling disguised as a Buddhist nun. The journey, conducted hastily, was not a retreat according to the Empress Dowager, but a tour of inspection. After weeks of travel, the group arrived in Xi'an and beyond the protected mountain passes, and safe from the foreign armies should they have embarked on a chase in the heart of Muslim China under the protection of the Gansu Braves. The foreigners had no orders to pursue the Qing royal court, so were happy to remain in Beijing. Massacre of missionaries and Chinese Christians. In total, the recorded deaths of missionaries and Christians were in the thousands, with the official figures being 136 Protestant missionaries, 53 children, 47 Catholic priests and nuns, and between 200 and 400 of the 700 Russian Orthodox Christians living in Beijing at that time. In addition to those figures were the estimated 30,000 Chinese Catholics and 2,000 Chinese Protestants killed for their faith during the uprising. The Protestants' deaths were collectively termed as the Chinese martyrs of 1900. Orthodox, Protestant and Catholic missionaries and their Chinese parishioners were massacred throughout northern China by the Boxers or at the hands of government soldiers and authorities. After the declaration of war on the Western powers in June 1900, Yu Xian, the governor of Shanxi province since March of that year, implemented a brutal anti-foreign and anti-Christian policy. On the 9th of July, reports began circulating that he had ordered the execution of 44 foreigners, including women and children from missionary families, whom he had invited to the provincial capital of Taiyuan under the promise of protection. Although the eyewitness accounts of the time have been questioned as improbable, the event became a symbol of Chinese anger and anti-foreign hatred to become known as the Taiyuan Massacre. The England-based Baptist Missionary Society opened its mission in Shanxi in 1877. In 1900, all its missionaries in the province were killed, along with 120 of their converts. By the end of that summer, numerous foreigners and possible as many as 2,000 Chinese Christians had been executed just in that province. It was regarded by some Christian writers as the single greatest tragedy in the history of Christian evangelicalism. Aftermath, the Eight-Nation Alliance occupied Zhili province, today the province of Hebei, and parts of surrounding provinces, while Russia occupied Manchuria. The remainder of China was not occupied due to governors of those provinces forming the Mutual Protection of Southeast China that refused to obey the declaration of war and kept their armies and thus their provinces out of the war. Beijing, Tianjin and Zhili province were occupied by the International Expeditionary Force for more than 1 year. The Americans and British paid General Yuan Shikai and his army to assist the Eight Nations in suppressing the Boxers. Yuan Shikai's army killed tens of thousands of people during the anti-Boxer campaign across the provinces of Zhili and Shandong after the capture of Beijing by the Allied forces. During attacks on suspected Boxer areas from September 1900 until March 1901, European and American forces were allegedly engaged in tactics that included public decapitation of those suspected of having Boxer sympathies, systematic looting, the routine shooting of farm animals and crop destruction. There were also instances of religious buildings being destroyed, in addition to the burning of religious texts and public buildings being damaged, as well as physical, brutal assaults on Chinese women and girls. Contemporary British and American observers made the strongest claims against German, Russian and Japanese soldiers for the level of ruthlessness and the willingness to execute Chinese people of all ages, regardless of gender or political background, on occasion burning villages and killing the entire population of such communities. The German soldiers, while arriving too late to take part in the actual fighting during the uprising, were singled out by missionary Arthur Henderson Smith for the way they handed out what they considered justice for even the most trivial of offences. Australian soldiers that also arrived after the unrest had ended alleged that the German soldiers they encountered would extort ransom payments from villagers in exchange for not destroying their homes and crops. British journalist George Lynch stated that there are things I should not write and should not be printed in England, which would seem to show that this Western civilization of ours is merely a veneer over savagery. One newspaper called the aftermath of the siege a carnival of ancient loot, while others called it an orgy of looting by soldiers, civilians and missionaries. Their characterizations were a reminder of the sacking of the Old Summer Palace in 1860. Each nationality accused others of being the worst culprits in looting. American diplomat Herbert G. Squires filled several railway carriages with loot and artifacts. The British legation held loot auctions and proclaimed looting on the part of British soldiers was carried out in the most orderly manner. One British officer claimed it was the unwritten rules of war that a city which does not surrender at the last and is taken by storm is looted. For the remainder of 1900 and into 1901, the British held loot auctions every day except Sunday in front of the main gate to the British legation. Many of the looted items ended up in Europe or the USA. Some Western missionaries actively called for retribution in calling for the restitution of missionaries and of families of Chinese civilians who had lost their properties. The American writer Mark Twain even criticized the actions of some involved, calling it out in an essay he penned to the person sitting in darkness that attacked the reverend bandits of the American board, in which he especially targeted William Scott Ament, a missionary of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, one of the most respected missionaries in China. The controversy was front-page news throughout much of 1901. On the Chinese side of the uprising, many bannermen supported the Boxers, even sharing their anti-foreign sentiment. Banner armies had been largely destroyed by the Japanese resisting the invaders during the First Sino-Japanese War. Their living conditions were described as going from desperate poverty to true misery. When thousands of Manchus fled south during the fighting in 1900, their cattle and horses were stolen by Russian Cossacks as they burned the villages as the Russians advanced across northern China. In Beijing, the legation quarters and Catholic cathedral were both attacked by Manchu bannermen. Manchu royals, officials and officers such as Yu Xian, Prince Zhuang and Captain En Hui were executed or forced to commit suicide by members of the Eight Nation Alliance. On the 31st of December 1900, German soldiers beheaded the Manchu captain En Hui for killing the German envoy Van Kettler. Indemnity. After the capture of Beijing by the foreign armies, some of the Empress Dowager Cixi's advisors advocated that the war continue, arguing that China could have defeated the Eight Nation Alliance and that it was disloyal and traitorous people within China that allowed Beijing and Tianjin to be captured and that the interior of China was impenetrable. Dong Fuxiang was advised to continue fighting. However, Cixi decided that the terms were generous enough, and after she was assured she could continue her reign after the war, with China not being required to cede any territory. On the 7th of September 1901, the Boxer Protocol, also known as the Peace Agreement between China and the Eight Nation Alliance, was signed. China was fined 450 million taels of fine silver and war reparations. The reparation was to be paid by 1940 and would total 982,238,150 taels, with interest included. The sum of reparations was estimated to be 1 tael per person of the Chinese population at that time. China paid 668,661,220 taels of silver from 1901 until 1939. This was the equivalent of $61 billion at 2010 calculations. A large portion of the reparations paid to the US was diverted to pay for the education of Chinese students in US universities under the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program. To prepare the chosen students for this program, an institute was set up to teach the English language and to serve as a preparatory school. When the first of these students returned to China, they undertook the role of teaching subsequent students. From this beginning, the institute developed into Beijing's Tsinghua University. Long-term consequences. The occupation of Beijing by the foreign powers and the failure of the rebellion further helped to erode support for the Qing state. Support for reforms decreased while support for revolution increased. In the 10 years after the Boxer Rebellion, uprisings in China increased, particularly in the south. Support grew for the Tongmenhui, an alliance of anti-Qing groups, which later evolved into the Kuomintang. Cixi returned to Beijing in the belief that maintaining the Qing government was the best way to control China. The Qing state made further efforts at reform, including the abolishing of the Imperial examination in 1905. Along with the formation of new military and police organizations, the reforms simplified centrally run bureaucracy and made a start at revamping taxation policies. However, these efforts at reforming the Qing failed to maintain that government which was overthrown during the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. That brings us to the end of this video, highlighting a historical era that has helped shape China today. If you've enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link till the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.